In my 4th year married to Scott, his old flame Cheryl got divorced and returned to the country. Worse yet, I was diagnosed with cancer and was close to death. In the less than 6 months I had left to live, I continued playing the role of Scott's devoted wife, until my death. After reading the diary I left behind, Scott completely broke down. Holding that thin diagnosis report, I stood at the hospital entrance, contemplating calling Scott. I tapped to open the contacts on my phone, then closed it again. His number was the first to appear. His voice was as deep and cold as ever, but softened slightly when he said my name. "Nellie, I have some things to handle tonight, won't be home for dinner and might come back late, you should go to bed early." All the words I wanted to say were stuck in my throat. "Okay," I replied, as brief as usual. The line went dead, but I still held the phone to my ear. The sunset was bloody at the horizon. I had been married to Scott for 4 years, and I had liked him for nearly 10. I was lucky. Scott was being pressured by his family to find a spouse and was going on arranged dates just when he met me. Given that we were both reasonably good matches, we decided to just get our marriage license. Scott needed a wife, and I was a good fit. He was a man of few words, not prone to showing his emotions, and usually expressionless. It took me 2 years to thaw this block of ice, and finally, the ice melted for me. We started to resemble a normal married couple, living a life steeped in the mundane details of daily existence, slowly transforming into the ideal I had envisioned. But now, this dream, not long sustained, was about to be shattered. Today, the doctor confirmed I had pancreatic cancer. I also knew that today was the day Cheryl, his once beloved, returned. That's why he hurriedly hung up my call. To meet her, I didn't eat and waited for him in the living room for a long time. I waited until the night deepened, and when the living room door opened, I was jolted awake from a drowsy stupor. Scott carefully closed the door and tiptoed in. The moment the living room light turned on, our eyes met. He paused briefly, then frowned slightly. "Why haven't you gone to bed?" "I accidentally fell asleep here in the living room." I looked at him and smiled. "I just woke up when I heard some noise." Scott just grunted, his expression unchanged. I stepped forward to take his coat. Sandalwood mixed with gardenia scent wafted into my nostrils, nauseating me. That was Cheryl's favorite scent. On the day I was diagnosed with a terminal illness, my husband had driven to pick up his returned old flame. I should have asked him about it, but I just opened my mouth and said nothing, as if nothing had happened. The next day, I still got up early as usual to make breakfast for Scott. Scott had a stomach condition. During a severe episode, he had to stay in the hospital for half a month, and I stayed with him throughout. The hospital's doctors and nurses all said he had found a good wife. Sitting on the hospital bed, Scott looked weary, his gaze on me unfluctuating. When we were alone in the hospital room, he spoke again. "Hiring a caregiver would have been the same." My hand paused while slicing fruit, and the continuous peel broke. He seemed to notice. "But it's different, actually. It's not really different. But people always feel that doing things themselves is better than leaving them to others. You always care more for the ones you love than others do. What's different?" I looked at him and smiled, giving a seemingly unrelated answer. "You are my husband." His stomach condition wasn't cured completely, and after he was discharged from the hospital, I always thought about nourishing his stomach. Scott is a workaholic, often forgetting to eat when he's busy. I get up early to make breakfast for him, and sometimes, when I have time, I go to his office to bring him lunch. If I'm too busy, I remind him to eat at meal times. Over 2 or 3 years, many things have become habits, like waking up early. Today, Scott got up earlier than usual. I didn't have time to straighten his tie before he grabbed the lunchbox from the table and rushed out. As he was leaving, he paused, turned back to look at me standing in the living room. His expressionless face softened a bit, like the sky clearing after a fresh snow. "I'm heading out, Nellie, be careful on the road." Just like countless other mornings, going to deliver lunch to Scott at noon was just a spur-of-the-moment decision. I didn't tell Scott, and the receptionist at his company, who recognizes me, greeted me and let me go up. I've been to Scott's company many times. He has always introduced me openly to everyone as, "This is my wife." This title carries a hint of last century's antiquity, yet it spontaneously conjures thoughts of unwavering affection from that era. I almost believed that we could continue on like this forever, but life always loves to play jokes. First, it grants you a beautiful dream, then shatters it, leaving you amidst the ruins, to glimpse its truly fierce face. Like now, I saw my husband, talking to his long-lost beloved, his white moonlight, in her hands. She held the lunchbox I had packed for Scott's breakfast. Cheryl seemed unchanged. Still the same as she was in college, with long hair draped over her shoulders, smiling like a harmless yet sly cat. "Thanks, Scott, the breakfast was delicious." "No problem," Scott replied, taking the lunchbox. Cheryl was about to say something else when her gaze suddenly caught me standing not far away. She became excited, her eyes curving like crescent moons. "Nellie, long time no see." She hurried over to me, reaching for my hand, but paused when she noticed the lunchbox in my hand. "Did you come to bring lunch for Scott? Was the breakfast this morning also made by you?" "Sorry, I was just feeling a bit hypoglycemic, and Scott let me eat it. If I had known it was prepared by you for Scott, I wouldn't have eaten it." Cheryl smiled apologetically. "But I must say, Nellie, your cooking is really good." "Of course, it's good. Scott is picky due to his stomach issues. I honed my cooking skills bit by bit for him. He knows it." I smiled back at her, while hiding my clenched hand behind me, my nails almost digging into my flesh. In that moment, along with anger, I suddenly felt an incredible sense of unwillingness. Plans for revenge also started to crystallize in that moment. Scott would never cheat. Even though I still feel panicked by Cheryl's presence, I strive to play the role of a competent wife. Whether the shackles of morality and responsibility will weigh heavier on Scott, I don't know. Who will break first, him or me? When he came back in the evening, he brought me a gift. The pink diamond was dazzling under the lights, and its exquisite design clearly indicated its high value. It was beautiful, but I didn't like it. I rarely wear jewelry, only dressing up when accompanying Scott to dinners. Scott isn't eloquent, and I knew this gift was nothing more than his way of apologizing and making amends for what happened this morning. Still, I smiled and accepted it. Scott's expression softened slightly. I didn't know if it was because I didn't hold a grudge, or because I wasn't angry with Cheryl. I casually placed the box in the drawer and went to bed before he did, but I couldn't fall asleep. When he returned to the room and lay down beside me, the familiar scent of sandalwood enveloped me, and he carefully wrapped his arms around me from behind. The warmth of his body seeped through the thin fabric toward me, and I closed my eyes, breathing evenly, until the person behind me fell asleep, and I was still wide awake. The discomfort in my upper abdomen grew stronger. I opened my eyes. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting a silvery glow all over. I stared at it for a long time, so long that the world seemed eerily silent, as if I were the only one left. It was only then that it belatedly dawned on me. I was about to die. In the morning, as I saw Scott off, a notification from the calendar on my phone popped up. I glanced at it hurriedly, then remembered that today was the day to visit my mother. My parents divorced when I was very young. My father didn't love my mother and had already been involved with someone else, fathering a daughter older than me. My mother raised me by herself, providing for our family, so I vowed to study hard, but I was unlucky, becoming the target of bullying by a small group. Even though I hadn't done anything, perhaps it was just my clothes they disliked, or maybe something I said one day that they held against me. I didn't dare tell my mother, and the teachers couldn't control them. The more I resisted, the more aggressive they became. The day I was surrounded by many, I harbored a desperate thought, the rough texture of the brick in my bag providing some comfort. The leading girl's scornful gaze fell on my face, about to pronounce her judgment on me. Then Scott appeared. He was smart, knowing that this wouldn't be a one-time incident. He consciously protected me, blocking those who harbored thoughts of returning, and I passed my 3 years of middle school in peace. That's why I followed him unhesitatingly, attended the same university as him, and became a better person. But I was a step too late. Just as Scott was my light, he had also once met his light, Cheryl, who is also my half-sister from the same father. I brought some things for my mom. Now that she has a new family, I sat there for about 15 minutes, had a brief chat with her, and politely said goodbye. Taking a cab back, I approached the entrance of my residential area, and from a distance, I saw them again. Cheryl and Scott were walking side by side, talking about something. I saw my usually reserved husband bending his lips into a smile, his eyes soft with amusement. I froze in place, watching them laugh. A dirty little dog suddenly jumped out of the bushes behind them. Barking at Cheryl, the two stopped, and as Cheryl reached to pet it, the little dog yelped and leapt towards her legs. Terrified, she quickly sought refuge in Scott's arms. Scott steadied her, his hand briefly touching her waist before quickly letting go. As I turned my head, I saw Cheryl react even faster than him. Nellie, I walked over woodenly, just as Cheryl was about to say something. I bent down before her and picked up the dirty dog from the ground. The little dog seemed scared too, burrowing into my arms, but it didn't struggle. Scott, I said, looking at him with a smile, I'm going to keep it. The atmosphere suddenly cooled. I just smiled and repeated, I'm going to keep it. Scott accompanied me to the veterinary hospital, where the dog underwent a checkup. It turned out to have many problems. Its bones were fractured, there were scratches on its abdomen, and countless other minor issues. But it was well behaved, allowing the vet to examine it without any fuss. Just lying quietly, Scott looked at me, wanting to say something but stopping himself. He remained silent all the way home after the checkup. The dog stayed in the hospital, and I named it Lucky. The atmosphere between us became abruptly stiff when we got home. Scott didn't speak, and I kept silent too. It wasn't until we both entered the bedroom that the warm orange light suddenly made the room very cozy. I sat on the bed and watched Scott come in wearing his pajamas. The warm light softened his sharp features slightly. His emotions weren't outwardly visible. Occasionally, I would see him smile, but it was just a brief twitch of his lips, like a fleeting bloom, quickly disappearing. I didn't know how much Scott felt for me. Over the years, I thought he might have been somewhat moved, but these thoughts seemed ridiculous after Cheryl came back. Scott, I suddenly called out to him. He looked up at me, his expression innocent yet indifferent. Do your words still hold? What words? You said, I am your wife, you would be good to me for a lifetime. I looked at him and smiled. Scott suddenly looked away, his voice indifferent. Why ask this all of a sudden? It's nothing, just remembered. A vague pain surged in my upper abdomen. The pain in my waist intensified at night, and my nerves throbbed as if they were being tightly twisted. Yes, he answered just as the light in the room went out. His warm breath fell on my cheek, and he gently kissed me. Good night, Nellie. As his breathing behind me gradually steadied, I carefully extricated myself from his embrace, turning to face him. Then, using the moonlight, I traced his features inch by inch, from his brow to his chin. Scott would not have an affair, but he was always thinking of Cheryl. Suddenly, I wanted to know, if I died, what would Scott feel when he remembered these moments? Leaving the hospital that day, so many thoughts crossed my mind, eventually tangling into a messy ball of yarn in my brain. The first thought that popped up was, what would Scott do if I died? He would have to remarry. At that moment, I thought, if Cheryl got divorced and he lost his wife, the two of them would end up together. It doesn't matter, but definitely not now. So, I've changed my mind. The first time I met Cheryl was on my 10th birthday. My mom took a rare day off to take me out to a restaurant. It was a fancy place, and the dishes were quite expensive. So Mom only ordered a few items. Not far from us, there was a family of 3, laughing and chatting, while my mom and I were somewhat silent. The girl at that table kept laughing, dressed in a beautiful princess gown and wearing a glowing crown. Her father sat across from her, constantly taking pictures of her. It wasn't until her father got up to go to the bathroom that a familiar profile caused me to drop my fork onto the table. My mom noticed my reaction and followed my gaze, then calmly looked back. Should we go over and say hello? She asked calmly. After all, he is your father. When my father returned to his seat, the little girl ran to him with a laugh. He picked her up in his arms, and both of their faces were brilliantly smiling. I shook my head. My memory of Dad is vague because he never was close to me. Whenever I tried to act affectionately towards him, he would scold me coldly. The fragmented image of my father confused me for a long time. Later, I realized he just didn't love me. All those things that seemed unreachable to me were easily accessible to Cheryl. I continued to pretend to be ignorant and treated Scott well, occasionally smelling the scent of gardenias on his clothes. Sometimes I saw a bit of Scott in the photos posted by Cheryl's friends on social media, subtle yet evident. I would pause on each one for a long time, then leave a heart, but I never spoke of it, just like before, maintaining a superficial peace, yet subtly, there was a hint of an impending storm. Only now, I had quit my job, there was a new pet named Lucky at home, and I had picked up the habit of writing in my journal again. I wrote every day, documenting the mundane daily life and my physical condition. I started to have sleepless nights, with a dull pain in my abdomen. I cooked for Scott every day, but when it came time for me to eat, I would stare at the food on the table for a long time, without any desire to eat. When I visited my mom again, we only chatted for about 10 minutes as usual. Before leaving, while she wasn't looking, I slipped a bank card with a password and most of my savings into a book on the table. This was the last time I was visiting her. She saw me to the door and, looking at my face, added, "Take care of yourself." "Thank you, you too, my mom will be fine." She didn't love Dad, nor did she love me, but she still took on the responsibility of a mother and raised me healthily. Later, perhaps as karma, my dad went bankrupt, but my mom's good fortune arrived. She married the man she loved, had a younger brother, and their family of 3 lived harmoniously. Scott came home early that night, just as I finished cooking dinner. Steam rose from the dishes on the table. We hadn't eaten together like this in a long time. Since Cheryl came back, he had become increasingly busy. Scott had good manners, eating silently and speaking only after the meal. Once, I thought it was beautiful just for 2 people to sit together in silence. Scott leisurely picked at his food while I managed only a few bites before losing my appetite as a faint pain began to nag at my stomach. Just then, Lucky came bounding down the stairs and dove under the dining table. I put down my utensils and, catching Scott's glance, explained, "I'm going to get some dog food for Lucky." Lucky's room was upstairs, a converted storeroom I had turned into his den. The dog bowl was empty, so I filled it a bit, and Lucky, wagging his tail, buried his head in his meal. Watching him, I felt a little better. Suddenly, the pain in my stomach intensified, and a sweet, metallic taste surged up my throat. I covered my mouth with my hand, and when I removed it, the sight of my blood-stained fingers made my eyes hurt. Lucky stopped eating immediately and rushed to my feet, barking at me. I wiped off the blood with a tissue, crumpled it, and threw it into the trash can. Then, crouching down, I gave his head a firm stroke and whispered, "I'm okay." He barked twice more, refused to eat, and leaped onto me. I lifted him into my arms, and he quieted down, nuzzling against me. Someone knocked on the door frame. Scott stood there watching us, saying gently, "Come eat, Nellie." I really wasn't hungry but forced myself to finish my meal while Scott went to wash the dishes. When he returned and saw me on the couch playing with Lucky, he sat beside me. "Nellie, I've been busy lately. When things slow down, let's go to the island." "Okay." I rubbed Lucky's ears and replied, "Okay." Going on a vacation to the island with Scott had always been on my wish list. We were strangers to each other once. Even after we got married, we didn't go on a honeymoon. Life just went on as usual, work and home. As our relationship improved, I always thought about taking a delayed honeymoon trip to the island with Scott. I never told Scott about this little wish of mine, just mentioned the idea of a trip a few times, but his workaholic schedule was always too packed, pushing it further back. Now, he was the one bringing it up, out of the corner of my eye. I saw him looking at me, his phoenix eyes slightly curved. I pretended not to notice. He spoke again. "There's a dinner next Wednesday. Are you free to join me?" I paused, then quickly regained my composure. "I won't go." Scott didn't ask further, just nodded. My gaze stayed on Lucky, no longer paying attention to Scott. Cheryl had just returned to the country, with few connections. She wouldn't miss such a good opportunity. If she asked Scott for help, he wouldn't ignore her. Lucky, lying on my lap, grunted twice, and I stroked his head, but Scott probably didn't expect that I would show up at the banquet he attended with Cheryl behind my back. Yet, I was there. The banquet was dazzlingly lit, with men in suits and women adorned in jewels moving around the hall, glasses clinking, everyone enjoying themselves, and there I stood on the periphery, out of place, like an intruder. Scott was easy to spot. I had been chasing him for over a decade, searching for him in crowds countless times. He wore a well-tailored suit. The woman holding his hand by his side was dressed in a red dress, bright as a rose. It was Cheryl, watching them mingle in the glamorous world, chatting and laughing with ease. They seemed like a match made in heaven, even though I had anticipated this scene. Seeing it with my own eyes still felt like a slap in the face. My heart pounded violently, anxiety wrapping around it tightly, squeezing until it hurt like it was about to burst. The thoughts in my mind tangled into a mess, veins throbbing at my temples, yet, I did nothing but stand there, watching them hold hands, smiling and greeting everyone. I saw someone walk over to Scott, tap him on the shoulder, and point in my direction. Scott turned his head to look. I wasn't wearing a fancy dress and had become very thin. I had long been afraid to look in the mirror, fearful of seeing my increasingly prominent cheekbones and a face that subtly revealed a skeletal appearance. I knew he saw me, because his expression changed instantly, and it was not pleasant. Across the bustling crowd, we just stared at each other from a distance. I just quietly watched him, neither smiling nor crying. Seeing his expression change, he broke free from Cheryl's hand and started towards me, his steps hindered by the crowd. Suddenly, I smiled at him and then turned around, leaving the place. When I got home, I went straight to my old room. The tangled mess in my mind couldn't be unraveled. The vines around my heart tightened even more, as if they were about to explode the next second. I could no longer keep calm. Everything on my desk was swept to the floor, crashing down with a loud noise. It wasn't enough. The books on the shelf were wildly torn by me, sheets of paper fluttering to the ground like untimely snow. Still not enough. The little ornaments on the shelf, makeup, skincare products, delicate crafts Scott brought me from his trips, and the Lego sets we assembled together, destructive urges and rage intertwined, emotions parading arrogantly in my mind. The floor was a mess, chaotic, just like my shattered life. When I snapped back to reality, the scissors were already pressed against my arm, and Lucky was frantically barking by my legs. The dog's bark was sharp and urgent. But it quieted down when I looked down at it, opening its mouth to reveal a silly smile. The scissors dropped to the floor, and Lucky quickly jumped on me, barking and pouncing. I numbly scooped it into my arms, and it vigorously rubbed its fluffy head against me, its small body warm. Holding it, tears suddenly fell, all the impulses faded, and the destruction did not bring satisfaction, only leaving a deep abyss in the depths of my heart. Such torment. When Scott came home, I had already cleaned up the room. He wanted to talk to me. I sat on the sofa looking at him and smiling, knowing he wanted to explain but not knowing how to start. I had been with him for 4 years, navigating the world of fame and prestige. Scott was not particularly eloquent, but he was clear and organized. His words, however, always came out cold and detached. It was I who taught him bit by bit how to handle situations and how to deal with the old hands at networking. Now he excels in such settings, yet away from the spotlight, he still remains sparing with his words. I used to think I loved him no matter what, but now, it seems maybe it was just because he hardly spoke to me. With a smile, I responded, effectively silencing all his words. It's okay. I know Cheryl has just returned to the country and doesn't have a network. You wanted to help her by taking her to the dinner. Scott's expression changed. Yes, it's okay, I said gently, looking at him. I don't mind. Scott looked at me, silent. Our eyes met. I kept my gaze on him, gentle all the while. After a long while, he finally averted his eyes. Then, suddenly, he hugged me tightly, as if trying to merge me into his body, making it hard for me to breathe. His warm breath fell on my ear. Nellie, it was intimate. You've lost weight. I smiled but did not respond. The scent of sandalwood mixed with gardenia surrounded us, and I forcefully suppressed the urge to vomit. The next morning, as usual, I saw him off to work. I thought he was about to leave, but Scott suddenly stopped in the living room. Nellie, in a gentle voice, he said, I forgot to tie my tie. Somewhat resigned, I went upstairs to grab one for him and handed it to him. Scott didn't take it, instead bowing his head. Help me, Nellie. I did as he asked, and once I had adjusted the tie, I announced, done. Suddenly, his hands confined my waist, pulling me close against him. I looked up at him. Scott. All words were stifled as his lips met mine, warm and urgent. Scott kissed me fiercely, It was like a beast tearing through its disguise, filled with ferocious desire. When we parted, a faint blush tinged the corners of his eyes. I looked at him, silent. Scott then kissed my forehead, his lips curling into a slight smile. "I'm off, Nellie," I smiled and bid him goodbye. I had made plans with Cheryl. We agreed to meet at 10 in the morning. I arrived on time and waited for her in the cafe for an additional half-hour before she leisurely appeared. Cheryl was beautiful, having lived a privileged life before her father went bankrupt. After her father's bankruptcy, she was still fortunate, having married abroad. Now, divorced and back in the country, she had Scott's support everywhere. How lucky. Cheryl sat opposite me, her makeup immaculate, her smile sweet, and me, with dark circles under my eyes, gaunt, looking utterly unwell. "Nellie, why did you suddenly ask to meet?" Our connections were not deep, merely former schoolmates at best, and I wondered how she could address me so familiarly. I hadn't touched the fruit tea ordered on the table. The cool touch helped me regain my composure. "You've already ordered, huh?" Cheryl's gaze fell on the table, and she smiled as she called over the waiter, "An iced Americano, please." She then propped her chin on her hands and smiled at me. "Scott likes iced Americano too." I didn't used to like it, but I've started to enjoy it recently. I took a sip of my fruit tea and didn't respond. Cheryl's smile was innocent yet mischievous. She was the one who told me she had divorced and returned to the country. Her tone was polite, yet unmistakably smug. It was as if she couldn't wait to tell me, "I'm back to steal your husband." After the aroma of the fruit tea dissipated, only bitterness lingered in my mouth. Cheryl's iced Americano hadn't arrived yet, and her gaze remained fixed on me. Seeing me look up at her, the smile on her lips deepened. "Speaking of which, I should thank your family." Her words were suddenly cut off by a loud noise in the hall. A few seated customers stretched their necks, looking our way. Cheryl turned her face slightly, a blush spreading across her pale cheeks, as if she had been stunned by my sudden slap. She covered her face and turned to look at me. "Nellie." I didn't want to hear her call my name, and one slap wasn't enough to vent my anger. I picked up the fruit tea from the table and poured it over her head. The dark liquid streamed down her hair, dripping onto the table and staining her white shirt. Lemon slices, peaches, and bits of fruit stuck to her hair, clothes, and bag. Her makeup, not very waterproof, began to run. She looked ridiculous and laughable. She paused, and in the cafe, numerous eyes were fixed on us, watching every move. Suddenly, her eyes reddened, and she looked like she was about to cry, eliciting sympathy. "Nellie, what are you?" "Cheryl," I cut her off coldly. "You know what you did. Don't play your innocent games with me." Tears shimmered in her eyes, threatening to fall. "You came back for Scott. You knew he would treat you well and you wanted to steal him away, right?" I looked at her calmly, my voice steady. Her face turned deathly pale for a moment, then she quickly regained her composure, pulling out a wet wipe from her bag to slowly clean her face. "Yes." Cheryl looked at me, slowly curling up a smile full of determination. Her voice lowered. "Nellie, love can't be forced." We had crossed a line. I looked at her and suddenly smiled. "You're right, Cheryl. How about we make a bet? If you win, he's yours. I will step aside willingly, and you won't have to worry about being the other woman." Cheryl watched me quietly, smiling sweetly. "All right." When Scott came home, I was writing in my diary. Hearing him enter, I put down my pen and stuffed the diary into the drawer. Scott had been coming home early recently. Sometimes, he would even join me for walks with Lucky in the evening. One night, as I sat in bed reading, he suddenly came over and pulled me into his arms. I leaned against him, feeling the warmth that belonged to someone else. He rested his chin on my head and read along with me the melodramatic romance novel in my hands. In the story, when the male lead supported the secondary female character, and she slapped the protagonist, she cried out, "I am your wife." His hand around my waist tightened. I casually turned to the next page. I continued reading, watching the male lead repeatedly help the supporting female suppress the protagonist, seeing her get hurt again and again, until she finally resolved to leave him. The male lead suddenly realized his mistakes and immediately began to chase his wife, going round and round until they reached a happy ending. I finished the book in the middle of the night. I remembered the sleeping pills in another room and tried to extract myself from Scott's embrace. but he didn't let go and held me tightly. Scott Brown. I called out to him. What? He responded softly. The room fell silent, so quiet that I could hear his heartbeat. Nellie, he murmured as he buried his head in my shoulder, his voice carrying a hint of grievance. You never used to call me by my full name. I almost wanted to laugh. Scott never used to call me full name either. He used to address me with a distant and unfamiliar attitude, politely calling me Miss Nellie. It seems we both have changed. I turned to face him, wrapping my arms around his waist, and cheerfully called him Scott. He looked at me, his eyes meticulously searching every bit of my emotion. Then he closed his eyes and pulled me a bit closer. Nellie, I never knew Scott could be so affectionate, but if he truly loves me, why does he care so much about Cheryl? It's been a week since I arranged to meet Cheryl. Our wedding anniversary is approaching, and Scott has been more clingy. Today is the 100th day of my diary, coincidentally also our anniversary. Scott remembered something I mentioned in passing and came home early. Spending the afternoon busy in the kitchen, I took Lucky out for a walk, and when I returned, he had already set everything up at home. The table was laid with delicious-smelling dishes, and Scott stood by with a smile, his eyes soft as he looked at me. Nellie, welcome back. Roses and music, cliché but romantic, underneath the champagne. There were 2 tickets dated for the day after tomorrow. I glanced at Scott, then at the tickets, and smiled. The clock pointed to 8. The atmosphere was perfect. Until Cheryl's call came through. She was crying pitifully, saying she felt terrible. Scott, I'm really suffering. I'm here all alone in a strange place. Can you come and help me? Scott, the romantic atmosphere shattered abruptly. Scott glanced at me, just that one look, and I understood. I'm sorry, Nellie, I'll take her to the hospital and come right back. It'll be quick. I just asked him one thing. Can you not go? Scott looked at me, silent. The atmosphere dropped to freezing in an instant. I saw the smile fade from his lips, turning back into the Scott from 4 years ago, the stranger Scott. He averted his eyes, then reassured me, I'll be right back. I won't miss our anniversary. It seemed like we were at a stalemate. Finally, I gave in. I said, okay. Scott turned and walked towards the door. While I stood in the living room watching his retreating figure, he looked back. I smiled, just like countless times before. Like a dutiful wife greeting her husband, I said, be careful on the road. He replied, okay. I watched him disappear into the night, the music still playing from the stereo. Casually, I smashed it to the ground, and after a loud crash, the living room fell silent. I turned and went back to my room. Scott wouldn't be coming back today. I knew that. Cheryl had won the bet, but I hadn't lost either. I returned to my room, locked the door, and pulled out my diary from the drawer. Flipping to the latest page, as I began to write on the last page, I suddenly found it extremely difficult. All thoughts in my mind scattered again, like an unsolvable code. My abdomen, head, and heart felt as if they were being carved open with a knife. I suddenly felt very cold, as if it seeped out from my bones. My hand trembled as I held the pen, but I still wrote meticulously. Today is our wedding anniversary. Scott cooked for me and even decorated the house. He also planned to take me to an island. The ceremony hadn't started yet when Cheryl called. Scott went to find Cheryl. He left me behind. I can never go to the island now. Goodbye, Scott. Tears fell, blurring the ink on the paper. Yet, I felt no sadness. The tears came from pain. I live by love, the love from others and the love I have for myself. Because without anyone to love me, I survive on my love for Scott alone. I loved Scott so much. After all this genuine love was exhausted, I was left as nothing but a shell, like a candle burnt out to its end, not meant to last. My last bit of love for Scott dissipated today. With the final word written, I sat at the desk, laughing heartily, a liberating laugh. My role in this drama ends today. Why I kept secrets from Scott, why I pretended not to see their trivial affairs, why I gave Cheryl a chance. What I gave Cheryl was not a vine to climb, but a sharp, pointed knife. The living cannot compete with the dead. It doesn't matter if Scott does not love me, but he will never forget me for the rest of his life. He owes me. I want him to feel guilty, to regret. I want him to read this diary, to repeatedly experience my feelings, to spend his life recalling how, as his wife succumbed to a terminal illness, he slowly pushed her into an even deeper abyss of despair. This absurd play is driven to its climax by my death. Next, it's Scott and Cheryl's turn, the hard sleeping pills lodged in my throat, uncomfortable. Forced down by swallowing, on the countertop, not only my diary lay but also the meticulously written recipes for him. His stomach is weak, and he's picky. Over these 4 years, I've slowly figured out what suits his taste. Also, my final gift to him, I lay quietly on the bed, hands folded, waiting for death to arrive. The room was very silent, until a dog barked outside. Something heavy kept bumping against the door, making a dull sound, and I, staring at the ceiling, ignored it all. Lucky was still barking, but sleepiness began to dominate my brain, consciousness fading away. Suddenly, Scott felt an immense panic, as if he was about to lose the most important thing. It resembled the day in the banquet hall, when he saw Nellie standing in the distance, pale and gaunt. He looked as though he might leave at any moment. Only one thought was screaming in his mind: hold on to her, don't let her go. But she left, overwhelmed by a huge sense of panic. He even forgot why he had attended the party. After spending over an hour distractedly, he hurried home. He thought Nellie would be angry, jealous, and question him furiously about why he had acted this way, but she didn't. Instead, she just sat on the couch, smiled at him, and then gently reassured him. His feelings of insecurity did not subside, they intensified instead. It's okay, Scott comforted himself. Nellie loved him. He always knew Nellie loved him because she was always straightforward, passionate, and sincere. He knew Nellie would be understanding and forgiving, so when Cheryl called him, crying and using that once familiar nickname, he agreed to meet. Nellie would understand him. He took Cheryl to the hospital, set her up with N4, and was about to leave when she suddenly grabbed his sleeve, with tears still in her eyes. Cheryl looked at him pleadingly. Scott, will you stay here with me for a while? Scott wanted to refuse. He had promised Nellie he wouldn't miss their anniversary, but there was Cheryl, looking at him with tearful eyes, her body frail and trembling, and it was night. He softened. When Scott returned, it was already past midnight. The living room light was on, casting a warm glow in the dim, pre-dawn light. Scott quickened his pace, eager to see Nellie, but Nellie was not in the bedroom, nor in the study, or in the room she once lived in alone. She was nowhere to be found. The food on the dining table had gone cold, untouched. In a corner of the living room lay the remnants of a sound system, smashed forcefully onto the floor. Only a few of her clothes and Lucky were missing. Nellie was angry. Scott thought she had just gone traveling in a huff. It was okay, she would cool down. He would wait a few days for her return, apologize, and explain everything, but after a few days, Nellie still hadn't returned. No one knew where she had gone. Nellie's phone was off. Her colleague said she had resigned 3 months ago, and her mother mentioned she hadn't seen her for a month. Please let her know when she has time to take back her bank card. I don't need her money, she can keep it, said her mother, her tone polite yet distant. It was then that Scott began to sense something was terribly wrong. Panic returned, fiercer than before, like a giant wave surging after a brief retreat. Scott started to track Nellie's whereabouts, checked her social activities over the past few days, and even looked into the dashcam records. Nellie's days seemed simple: going out in the morning for a walk, buying groceries, coming home for lunch, and taking Lucky out in the afternoon. Day after day, but sometimes, she would drive to the hospital. Scott was no fool, a series of actions strung together, and the answer is nearly palpable. When he occasionally woke up at night, he saw her leaning against the headboard, staring out the window, with not a trace of sleepiness. He embraced her increasingly emaciated body. There was also the ever-silent atmosphere at the dining table and her furrowed brows. Scott didn't believe it, because she hadn't said anything to him. But he couldn't help but believe, because she hadn't said anything to him. Scott had searched for her for a long time, but Nellie had disappeared without a trace. 1.5 months later, an unfamiliar call reached him. It informed him that Nellie had passed away. Nellie had died in a sanatorium on an island. By the time Scott arrived, her ashes had already been scattered into the sea. The person who received him was Nellie's caretaker, a young woman whose attitude towards him was indifferent. In the room where Nellie had lived, she handed him 3 notebooks. "These are Miss Nell's diaries and some other records." The woman paused, then added, "Nellie wanted me to burn them, but I thought Scott should see them." As she left, she gave Scott one last look, her eyes undisguisably cold. Scott sat quietly in the room for an entire afternoon. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window bars, warming the room, but sitting there, he felt as if someone was choking him. Until midnight, he opened Nellie's diary, those details he had deliberately ignored. The hidden tears and blood, all the pain she had swallowed alone, wove into a sharp net that slashed his heart into shreds. May 17th, the doctor told me I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He looked at me with a bit of pity. Actually, I didn't really listen to much of what he said. Basically, it's incurable. The doctor advised me to be admitted to the hospital for treatment as soon as possible. I don't want to. I dislike hospitals, their cold walls, the ubiquitous smell of disinfectant, and the oppressive atmosphere, and there's no one to accompany me. I thought about calling Scott, but I didn't know how to start. What should I say? Should I tell him that I'm dying? Better not to say anything. But then Scott called, saying he'd be home late because he had something on. Suddenly, I remembered, today Cheryl was coming back. Scott, did he go to pick her up? May 18th, went to Scott's office to bring him lunch. I ran into Cheryl. She looked as beautiful as ever. The lunch I made for Scott in the morning, she ate it. I was angry, but later, I realized, whatever I gave to Scott, it was his to do with as he pleased. May 21st, I went to see Mom. She's doing well. I originally wanted to tell her, but then I thought better of it. Mom is already very happy now. I shouldn't disturb her. On the way back, I ran into Scott and Cheryl, and a little dog. I wanted to keep it. The moment I spoke out, I saw Scott's face change, but I insisted on keeping it. The vet asked me what its name was. Let's call it Lucky. May 22nd, last night before bed, I asked Scott if his words still held. He said they did. If only I were a bit sillier, then I wouldn't see his evasion. May 25th, I saw Scott in a photo Cheryl posted on social media, a gathering of young talents, with just a corner of his face showing in the bottom left. Her caption read, "It's great to have a business magnate as a friend." I also thought it was nice, so I gave her a like. May 28th. Lucky has been home for a few days now, and the dog supplies I ordered online have arrived. I went to the courier station to check, and the owner had packed them all together. It was quite a lot. When Scott came back, I told him to help me pick up Lucky's parcels. He agreed, then turned and headed to the study. I wonder if he'll remember. June 1st, Children's Day. I took Lucky out for the day. When we returned, I went in to collect the parcels. Lucky's room is on the 2nd floor. I didn't wait for Scott to return. June 7th, my sleep quality is terrible, and I often can't fall asleep. During the day, I took Lucky out and passed by a cake shop. It reminded me that it had been a long time since I last had a dessert, so I bought a box of tiramisu. But when I got home, I suddenly lost my appetite. I used to love desserts, but now, looking at the sticky cream, I just feel nauseous. June 19th. Scott seems to be getting busier and keeps telling me not to wait up for him at night. After fading from my life, he frequently appears in Cheryl's social media posts. I sometimes envy Cheryl. As a child, her father loved her. As an adult, her husband loved her. After her divorce, my husband seems to love her too. It feels like I have nothing. June 25th. My insomnia has become severe. Night after night of wakefulness and escalating pain. It hurts to stand, to sit, to lie down. It hurts so much. The person in the mirror looks extremely pale. There's a slight jaundice to the complexion. June 30th. Scott came home for dinner. Actually, it's been a long time since I last ate properly. Forcing myself to eat, I ended up throwing it up, so I just ate a little. I used feeding Lucky as an excuse to leave. Then, I vomited blood. I had only seen such scenes on TV, where the heroine, suffering from a terminal illness, coughs up blood. I might not have the heroine's fate, but I seem to have her illness. It's not a big deal, just vomiting blood. Compared to the pain and insomnia, the vomiting blood seemed trivial. July 5th, Scott asked if I wanted to go to a dinner party, but I declined. It's been a while since I looked in the mirror. I can't sleep at night, can't eat. Brushing my teeth in the morning, I caught a glimpse of a stranger in the mirror. My cheeks were hollow, cheekbones slightly protruding, dark circles under my eyes, and my lips pale. It seemed I had aged a lot suddenly, yet I am only in my 20s, supposedly in the prime of life. The end is getting worse, tormenting me, until death. I don't want to die looking so terrible. July 11th. Still, I went to the party. Scott and Cheryl looked good together. Had I not been going mad, this thought wouldn't have crossed my mind at first glance. Later, Scott saw me. He came over. But I ran away. I realized I was beginning to lose control of my emotions. If it weren't for Lucky being there, I don't know what I might have done. July 18th. Abdominal pain, insomnia. I threw up again after eating. July 22nd. The scissors left in the room were stained with blood. It was only when I came to my senses that I realized I had cut my arm. I quickly bandaged it up. It wasn't the first time. I plan to go to the hospital tomorrow to get some sleeping pills. July 26th. Stomach pain, vomiting blood. The pain worsens after eating. I don't want to eat anymore. July 30th. I almost passed out from the pain while lying in bed. When I regained consciousness, I saw Lucky licking my hand by the bed. I instinctively stroked its head. I grabbed my phone to scroll through my social media. Right when I opened it, I saw that Cheryl had gone to the beach. The photos in her grid were beautiful. In the last one, I saw Scott's hand. He was still wearing our wedding ring. August 1st. Pain. August 5th. Went to the hospital for some painkillers. August 15th. I saw Cheryl. She looked beautiful. It's been a long time since I last looked in a mirror. I know I've become very ugly. August 20th. The sleeping pills seem to be losing their effect. The doctor suggested I should be hospitalized. He said it would only get more painful towards the end. I refused. I never intended to make it to the end anyway. August 25th. Nellie died on this day, but Lucky saved her. August 25th. It was supposed to be my day to die, but Lucky wouldn't let it happen. It kept barking, incessantly, so loud that I couldn't sleep. So annoying that it unsettled my mind, so unbearable that I used my last bit of strength to call emergency services. Hours later, I woke up with an 4 in my arm. A nurse stood by my bed. "Where's Lucky?" She paused for a moment. "Lucky is." I tried to sit up, my body still not cooperating. The nurse helped me. "I want to go home. Your body is still very weak. You can't yet. I want to go home." My eyes drooped. I stubbornly repeated, "There's no Lucky here. I need to find Lucky." When I got home, it was already midnight. There were unread messages from Scott on my phone. I didn't look, just blocked him. As soon as I opened the door, the little cream-colored dog rushed into my arms. Lucky kept barking, rubbing against me, and licking me, holding it. Tears suddenly fell. All the suppressed emotions erupted like a flood. I sat on the cold living room floor, holding it and crying for a long time, crying until my eyes were swollen. Finally, I buried my face in its fur, whispering in a voice only we could hear, "Lucky, let's go. I want to go somewhere no one knows, just me and Lucky, and love." Lucky in my arms may not have understood my words, but it looked at me seriously, then slowly, meticulously, licked all the tears off my face. "No one in the world loves me, but a little dog does. A little dog will always love the person who brought it home. Lucky will always love Nellie." I traveled overnight to an island and settled in a sanatorium. Island life is as beautiful as I hoped. During the day, I play with Lucky on the beach, chat with the townspeople, and walk by the sea at night. I really like the ocean. The endless waves and the salty sea breeze somehow calm my mood. I hired a caregiver, a young girl, pretty and capable. After helping out for a few days, I told her that it might get even tougher going forward. She looked at me as I coughed up fresh blood and asked what was wrong with me. "Pancreatic cancer." I casually tossed away the tissue I used to wipe the blood and responded. Sophia's eyes immediately welled up with tears. I was somewhat panicked, unsure how to comfort her. Tears started falling from the girl's eyes. "Nellie, you're only in your 20s. Her tears dropped on my hand, burning hot. "Why would you get this kind of disease?" It's easier for girls to empathize with each other, even though we hadn't known each other for long, and even though she didn't really know about my life. The sorrow and sadness she felt for me were so genuine. I wasn't actually sad, because I was used to it, but when she carefully held my hand, choking up as she asked, "Does it hurt a lot?" I still ended up crying. The illness had already tormented me beyond recognition. From the moment I opened my eyes, the pain woke up with me, and it followed me like a shadow. I couldn't eat. All those foods that used to be delicious now tasted like wax to me. I was scared to eat, because it would hurt even more afterward. The pain wasn't just physical, neurological exhaustion from insomnia. Having no one to talk to, I could only chew over these pains day after day by myself. The only companion by my side was Lucky. The little dog couldn't speak. It just circled around me anxiously when I was in pain, whimpering. When I held it, it would stop barking. It just quietly licked my hand. "It hurts a lot," I told her. That phrase sounded like a complaint and somewhat coquettish. It was something you would normally say to someone who loves you, but I had no one to say it to. I couldn't tell my dad, because his daughter was only Cheryl. I couldn't tell my mom, because she was someone else's mom now. I couldn't tell Scott either, as he was busy planning a future for Cheryl. In the end, I told someone I barely knew. I had stopped going to the hospital for treatment. Treatments were just a way to painfully drag out my days. I relied on painkillers and sleeping pills to get by. Day by day, I grew thinner. Occasionally, when I looked in the mirror, the person reflected back had sallow skin and gaunt features, hardly recognizable as a young woman in her 20s. So ugly, I thought. Life was like a flower wilting rapidly. I began to lose the ability to walk. Sophia wheeled me out daily to bask in the sun, watching Lucky play on the lawn. Sometimes she pushed me to the seaside for a change, to feel the sea breeze. Lucky didn't mind my looks, always wanting to kiss me, but I wouldn't let it anymore. Sophia stopped asking about my illness and just chatted with me about the past, hers and mine, and gossiped about everything. One day, as she was tidying up, she saw the wedding ring I had hidden in the drawer and exclaimed, "Nellie, you're married." "Yeah, then your husband." She stopped mid-sentence, as if realizing something. I just smiled. He doesn't know I'm sick. Nor does he know I secretly came here." "Did you guys get divorced?" Sophia blurted out quickly, then immediately covered her mouth. "No." "Why did he do that?" I smiled, didn't answer her question, and changed the subject. Days on the island pass quickly. Happy times are always fleeting. I'm starting to give in. The painkillers have stopped working. The pain has become unbearable. I can't eat anything. I've hidden a knife in my room. Sometimes, the knife is already pressed against my wrist, but then I see Lucky sleeping peacefully in the room. I put it down again. Living has become a torment for me. I rarely go out anymore, but lying down also hurts. Sophia comes over to chat with me, talking about the town gossip. Her neighbor's daughter and her boyfriend broke up, causing a huge scene at the hospital. Sophia sighed. It was a horrific scene. How can someone use their own life to save a relationship? Because she loved too deeply once, it later turned into an obsession. That's why she can't let go. I looked at her and smiled. I used to be like her, because I've never been loved in my life. I've always longed for love. Sophia looked shocked. I never realized. "Nellie, you're so gentle." "Because I have Lucky now." Try to talk to her, Nellie. In the end, she will see reason. She still has a chance. Can cut her losses, and start anew, but I no longer have that option. I really can't hold on anymore. I asked Sophia to take me for a walk. By evening, there weren't many people by the seaside. We walked and stopped intermittently. It was very quiet along the way. Lucky didn't bark either. When she pushed me back to the room, Lucky squeezed in too. These past few days, I hadn't let it into the room. It ran to my bed, wanting to jump up and cuddle. I asked Sophia to take it away. It wouldn't let her carry it. Dodging left and right, then bared its teeth and growled fiercely at her. "Lucky." I called its name. It calmed down again, its eyes looking at me, inexplicably aggrieved. I glanced at Sophia. She picked it up and took it away. Outside, it barked a few times. The sound gradually faded. I remembered the first time I saw it. It was dirty and skinny, looking very pitiful. Later, the doctor said it had many health issues and had been abused. If only I could have met it sooner. The pain was so intense that my consciousness began to falter. I hope in the next life, I can bring Lucky home sooner. Let it be a happy and healthy little dog. it wouldn't have to suffer from hunger or cold, nor be abused, and I could learn to love myself sooner. When Sophia opened the door, a tall, thin figure was already standing in the yard. It was Nellie's husband. I don't know when he arrived, frost had settled on him. When he saw her, he gave a stiff smile, like a wind-up puppet. Sophia, could you take me to the places she used to frequent? Sophia didn't speak. She didn't like this man. Nellie had always been secretive about her marriage. Sophia could only indirectly inquire about any emotional matters. Of course, she was curious. One day, while helping Nellie tidy up her room, she knocked a book off the table. A notebook fell out and opened. She admitted to being curious, glanced at the contents while bending down to pick it up, carrying Lucky in his arms. The diary that was knocked over was Nellie's diary of unrequited love. The name Scott filled most of its pages. In her 20s, still rich in imagination, she pieced together a story of long-held, unrequited love from what Nellie had shared, a tale of marrying someone else in the end. That narrative persisted until the man who came to handle Nellie's belongings appeared, wearing a wedding ring identical to Nellie's and signing his name as Scott. She was suddenly bewildered. If Nellie had married the man she had loved for so long, why did she come here alone to slowly pass away, and what made her, until her death, never see her once beloved again? She couldn't understand, but she instinctively disliked this man. She had refused him, however. On the 5th morning when she opened the door to find him standing in the yard, Sophia relented. Scott accompanied Sophia to the places Nellie frequented, a park always bustling with people, a corner coffee shop, a circular road near the sanatorium, and a beach. The park was where she played with Lucky and other dogs. She often sat in the coffee shop for an entire afternoon. The circular road was close to the sanatorium, where she could walk farther when not using a wheelchair. The beach was where she lingered the longest. She and Lucky would snuggle together after playing, facing the sea, quiet, like two sculptures. Scott walked these places repeatedly, imagining over and over. 5 days later, he knocked on Sophia's door again. With unexpected trepidation, he hesitated before asking, "Sophia, can we talk about Nellie?" The person before him suddenly changed color, her hand trembling on the doorknob. After a long pause, she said, "I can't." The girl, usually cold to him, became emotionally charged, her eyes reddening. What does Scott want to hear? Hear about how she struggled alone with her illness? Hear about her dying alone, with only a dog by her side? Or hear about her unbearable pain as cancer ravaged her body? Nellie never complained of pain, but Sophia could see the veins on her forehead and the cold sweat. Sophia didn't cry when Nellie died. She didn't cry when Nellie's ashes were scattered into the sea. She didn't cry when she sent Lucky away, hearing that he refused to eat or drink in his new home, curling up into a small ball. But watching a person's life being destroyed by illness, watching her slowly wither, seeing her in such pain yet still gentle and calm, watching a living being turn into ashes held in her hands, how could she not be in pain? It was supposed to be the prime of life, yet everything was irretrievable. Tears fell heavily from Sophia's eyes. She cried uncontrollably, then raised her hand to wipe away the tears, with reddened eyes, her voice cold. "Scott, where were you when she was suffering from her illness? Where was he?" Indeed, Scott thought, he was with Cheryl. Scott stayed on the island for half a month. He found where Lucky now lived. He went there several times, trying to get Lucky back from the man who had taken him in. The new owner, a man with a fierce look, was unreasonable and stubborn, no matter how much Scott offered. The man ignored him, even threatening him with a broom to chase him away. Scott persisted, returning the day after being driven away. After 7 or 8 days, the man, unable to tolerate it anymore, stood at the door cursing Scott, then asked, "Why on earth do you want this mongrel so badly?" Scott stood silently, taking the scolding like a schoolboy. After a pause, when he heard the question, the air hung heavy. The man turned to go back inside, but suddenly heard Scott say, "She was my late wife's cherished companion." The burly man turned around, gave him a few glances, and then entered the house without looking back. Scott stood silently at the doorway. After a short while, he came back out, cradling the little white dog in his arms. The man handed Lucky over to him. "Take good care of her, otherwise, she'll blame you when you see her again." Lucky wasn't close to him. Scott took her home. But her bed and toys were still in the old house, yet every day Lucky stayed in the room where Nellie had once lived. Scott knew it was because it still smelled of her. The little dog curled up, burying itself in the pillows, quiet and well-behaved. Life seemed unchanged from before. Scott still went to work, came home, ate, lived, day after day. Only Nellie was missing. He was an adult. He ate when hungry, drank when thirsty, slept when tired. One morning, Lucky slipped out the door. When he opened it, she disappeared in an instant. He searched everywhere in a panic. When he returned home that evening, he found her squatting at the front door. Her dark eyes looked up at him. Then she barked softly twice. Scott picked her up and held her close, just like Nellie used to. The house lights were off. In the darkness, Scott held Lucky for a long time before he sighed. She wouldn't blame me. She wouldn't want to see him anymore. People at the company said Scott had changed, not colder, but gentler. Scott used to be sparing with words and always had a stern face. Lately, he smiled inexplicably. A little thing would make him gently praise you. The office was abuzz. If Scott weren't married, that smile would absolutely steal my soul. What happened to Scott? It's like he's been possessed. Is it possible? A girl giggled, holding her coffee, that Scott has been assimilated by his wife. Scott's wife was a beautiful woman, always smiling softly and warmly, yet very capable. Sometimes she came by, greeted everyone without airs. It's been a long time since Nellie last visited. Scott passed by the break room and heard this. Time seemed to pause at that moment. Scott stood at the door, unable to move forward. She would never come again. Lucky still ran outside every day. In the afternoon, she waited at the front door for Scott, then trotted upstairs into Nellie's room. When he returned, Scott became curious. What did she do outside every day? He followed her one day, watching her make her way to the park, find a sandbox, dig for a while, then leave and follow the same path back, circling the neighborhood twice. Then she would return home, squatting at the front door, waiting for him. At first, Scott didn't understand, until one day, a girl in the park petted Lucky and softly asked, "Lucky, who are you thinking of today?" Suddenly, it all made sense. Lucky hadn't forgotten Nellie. Her daily wanderings, exploring every corner, were in search of Nellie's scent, maybe even her shadow. Lucky barked twice, then fell silent. He suddenly realized this was the route Nellie took him on every day. Nellie was gone. He kept walking. That day, when Scott returned home, he followed Lucky into Nellie's room again. The little dog crawled under the desk and pulled out an empty bottle. Scott held the empty bottle and looked at it. It was labeled with sleeping pills. He suddenly remembered the line that had been crossed out. "I can't go to the island anymore. Goodbye, Scott." Nellie died that day, but Lucky saved her. The empty bottle of sleeping pills, the scratch marks on the door, the tear-blurred handwriting, the unanswered messages, and Nellie, who was supposed to die that day. The suppressed grief instantly turned into a torrential flood, overwhelming him. Regret transformed into a monstrous beast, swallowing him whole and then chewing him over and over. Scott collapsed on the floor, repeatedly recalling the details of that day. Like a form of self-torture, he kept thinking over and over. What exactly had he done? 3 days later, Joey finally knocked on his friend's door. Cheryl had sent Scott texts and called him, but he hadn't responded to any, so she reluctantly sought Joey's help. Joey stood at his door knocking for 3 solid hours. Scott, wearing only a white shirt stained with various liquor marks, opened the door, startling Joey. The strong smell of alcohol made him want to vomit, but fortunately, Scott looked just unkempt and smelled strongly of booze. Yet his mood seemed relatively stable. As usual, his face was expressionless, but he seemed communicable. Without a word, Joey entered the house, followed by Scott. The moment he saw the inside, he almost cursed out loud. The living room was filled with empty liquor bottles, neatly arranged on the floor. Everything in the house was in order. Scott sat on the sofa, picked up a bottle of liquor from the coffee table, and tilted it towards his mouth. Joey stepped forward and snatched the bottle away. The colorless liquid poured over Scott. He looked up at Joey, said nothing, just slowly reached into a box next to him and prepared to open another bottle. "Scott, have you lost your mind? You're lucky to be alive, and you're still drinking." Joey grabbed the bottle again, cursed twice, then saw his friend collapse on the sofa and close his eyes. Complete madness. When Scott woke up in the hospital, the first thing he saw was Joey at his side. His head felt foggy. As if he remembered Joey yelling at him, Scott thought for a while. All he remembered was drinking continuously, going to the bathroom to vomit when he couldn't drink anymore, and then continuing to drink. But he never got drunk. Joey put down his phone and saw his friend lying on the bed, staring straight at him. The lack of expression was even more frightening. Joey was furious. "Nellie's gone." The sudden statement interrupted Joey's anger, his friend's voice raspy like sandpaper. "Gone? Where to?" His mind couldn't catch up. Scott lowered his gaze. "She was sick." "What illness?" "Pancreatic cancer." Joey quieted down. "On our anniversary, Cheryl called me, said she was sick, asked me to come see her. When I was leaving, Nellie asked me if I could not go. I didn't answer. That night, she was alone at home and took a lot of sleeping pills." "Joey." Scott looked up, his eyes as still as stagnant water. "You say? What was she thinking when she last saw me off?" Joey remained silent. "When she took the sleeping pills and lay in bed waiting for death, what was she thinking?" No one answered. The person in the bed suddenly sat up, eyes red, voice hoarse and painful. It was unclear whether he was asking Joey or himself. "What do you think she was thinking?" Joey suddenly stood up. Without turning his head, he walked out, and the door of the hospital room slammed shut behind him. Only he was left in the room, alone. He stared desolately at the stark white walls. Eventually, he broke down in tears. After being discharged from the hospital, Scott quit his job. Every day, he took Lucky on walks along the paths they had once shared, day after day, year after year. He tried to cook following the recipes Nellie had written for him, from awkward to proficient, yet he always felt something was missing compared to Nellie's cooking. Later, he too began to suffer from insomnia. When he couldn't sleep, he would read Nellie's old diaries. Every page mentioned his name. He would read them over and over again, crying and laughing. It turned out she had carefully cherished her affection for him all those years. Eventually, Lucky could no longer walk. It had been a stray. With health issues everywhere, not expected to live long. If Nellie hadn't brought it home, it would have died 2 winters later. It stopped going out, curling up into a small ball each day on Nellie's pillow. Scott stopped going out too. After eating, he would just stay by its side. The day Lucky passed away, Scott was by its side. The little dog suddenly stood up shakily, barked twice towards something in the distance, then showed a silly smile and wagged its tail unsteadily. Scott watched as it tried to leap forward, then collapsed back on the bed, motionless. After about 10 seconds, it was still. Scott knew Nellie had come for it. As sleep overtook his last bit of consciousness, Scott thought, so this is what Nellie felt that day.